On Christmas Eve, 2002, a young, pregnant woman vanished from her quiet California neighborhood. Her name was Laci Peterson, 27 years old, full of life, and just weeks away from welcoming her first child. What began as a desperate search for a missing mother quickly spiraled into one of the most shocking murder cases in modern history. Behind the picture-perfect marriage, there was a dark secret one that would expose lies, betrayal, and a chilling act that stunned the world. Welcome to the Justice Vault, where we uncover the truth behind the world's most haunting crimes. Today, we're diving into the murder of Laci Peterson, a case that shattered the illusion of the perfect American family and left a lasting mark on true crime history. Laci Denise Peterson was full of life, vibrant, cheerful, and deeply devoted to her family. Born in Modesto, California, she met Scott Peterson while both were in college. Scott was charming, ambitious, and driven. Together, they seemed like the perfect couple, young, attractive, and in love. After they married in 1997, they bought a small home in Modesto. By 2002, they were preparing to welcome their first child, a baby boy they planned to name Connor. Friends say Laci was glowing during her pregnancy, excited to become a mother. She was known for her warm smile and kind heart, the type of person who made others feel instantly comfortable. To those around them, Scott and Laci Peterson appeared to have it all: a loving marriage, a stable home, and a future filled with promise. But appearances can be deceiving. On the morning of December 24, 2002, everything changed. Scott told police that he left home that morning to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina, nearly 2 hours away. Laci, he claimed, planned to walk their golden retriever, Mackenzie, through the neighborhood before running errands for Christmas dinner. When Scott returned that afternoon, Laci was gone. Her car was in the driveway. Her purse, phone, and keys were still in the house. Only the dog had been found wandering the neighborhood alone, leash still attached. At first, friends and family believed Laci might have been kidnapped. Within hours, the Modesto Police Department launched a massive search effort. Volunteers canvassed the area. Helicopters flew overhead. Flyers with Laci's smiling face were posted across the state. The media quickly descended on Modesto. This was more than just a missing person case. It was a human tragedy that struck at the heart of the holidays. But as days turned into weeks, investigators began to sense that something wasn't right. As news of Laci's disappearance spread, Modesto transformed overnight. The quiet streets were filled with flashing lights, reporters, and volunteers. Strangers came from nearby towns to help search fields, canals, and riverbanks. Everyone wanted to believe that Laci would be found, that she'd simply gone missing and would come home safe. But as investigators began retracing her last known steps, the story started to unravel. Scott Peterson told detectives he had left home around 9:30 that morning to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina, roughly 90 miles away. He claimed Laci was getting ready to walk the dog before heading out to shop for dinner ingredients. It sounded simple enough. But when detectives began looking closer, the details didn't quite fit. First, the timing. Scott said he arrived at the marina late that morning and fished for a few hours before heading home. But no one at the marina remembered seeing him. No witnesses. No receipts showing what time he'd arrived or left. The weather that day was cold, gray, and windy, not the kind of day most people would go fishing, especially on Christmas Eve. Then came the boat. Detectives discovered Scott had recently purchased a small aluminum fishing boat, just weeks before Laci disappeared, something he hadn't told many people about. When police examined it, they found it oddly clean. Too clean. There were traces of cement dust inside. And later they would learn, Scott had bought several bags of concrete shortly before Laci went missing. When questioned about that purchase, Scott said he'd used the cement to make an anchor for his boat, but only one anchor was found. The rest of the cement was unaccounted for. Investigators began to suspect that Scott's fishing trip wasn't about fishing at all. Meanwhile, Laci's family was clinging to hope. Her mother, Sharon Rocha, appeared on television pleading for her daughter's safe return. She stood beside Scott, urging the public to help bring Laci home. But to those watching, Scott's demeanor didn't match the moment. He didn't cry. He didn't appear desperate. He was calm, too calm. His voice never cracked. His eyes rarely watered. Reporters and investigators alike began to question whether the grief-stricken husband on camera was truly grieving at all. Behind the scenes, detectives were quietly digging into Scott's background. They began monitoring his calls, his credit cards, and his movements. And what they found next shattered the image of the devoted husband. Scott Peterson was having an affair. Her name was Frey, a massage therapist living in Fresno, about 2 hours away. Amber had met Scott through a mutual friend just a few weeks before Laci went missing. He'd told her he was single. In fact, he claimed he was a widower. Amber had no idea that Scott was married, let alone that his pregnant wife was missing. When Amber turned on the news and saw Scott's face, she was horrified. Within days, she contacted police and agreed to cooperate with the investigation. What followed became one of the most crucial parts of the case. Detectives began recording Amber's phone conversations with Scott, hoping he might slip up and reveal something about what really happened to Laci. Those calls revealed a chilling portrait of manipulation and deceit. Even as police and volunteers were scouring the countryside for Laci's body, Scott was on the phone with Amber, charming, romantic, even making plans for a future together. He never once mentioned that he was married, never acknowledged that his wife was missing. Then came New Year's Eve, just a week after Laci's disappearance. A vigil was held in Modesto to honor her and pray for her safe return. Cameras captured the emotional scene, hundreds of candles flickering in the cold night air. Among the crowd stood Scott Peterson. His face appeared blank, his posture rigid. And while the world believed he was mourning his missing wife, he was actually on the phone with Amber, telling her he was in Paris, watching fireworks. To detectives, that lie said everything. At this point, investigators were confident that Scott was involved. But without physical evidence, without a body, there was still no proof of murder. They needed more. They started piecing together a possible timeline. If Scott had killed Laci before leaving home that morning, he could have transported her body in his truck to the Berkeley Marina. From there, he might have used his small boat to dispose of her in the cold waters of the San Francisco Bay. But proving that theory was difficult. The bay was massive, with unpredictable currents and deep, murky water. Any evidence could have drifted for miles or vanished completely. Meanwhile, public opinion began to turn against Scott. The media seized on every inconsistency, every strange behavior. When Laci's family noticed he was selling her car and trying to sell the house just weeks after her disappearance, they were devastated. To them, it felt like he'd already moved on. Police soon learned that Scott had continued seeing Amber during the investigation, even attending a New Year's Eve party with her while pretending to be a grieving husband on national television. The story became a media circus. Talk shows, tabloids, and newspapers all painted Scott as the charming husband turned cold-blooded killer. But inside the Modesto Police Department, detectives knew they still needed something solid, something that could physically link Scott to Laci's disappearance. In February 2003, sonar scans and divers searched the waters around the Berkeley Marina. They found nothing. The currents were too strong, and visibility was nearly zero. Each day that passed, the chance of recovering Laci or any evidence grew smaller. Months went by. The search stretched into March, then April. Laci's family still held out hope, though in their hearts, they feared the truth. And then, one spring morning, everything changed. 4 months after Laci vanished, a couple walking their dog along the shore of San Francisco Bay made a horrifying discovery: the remains of a small fetus. The next day, just a short distance away, the partial remains of an adult female washed ashore. When investigators heard the news, they knew instantly what they were likely looking at. The location was the same area where Scott had said he went fishing that day. DNA testing confirmed the devastating truth. The remains belonged to Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. The search for Laci was over. But the real battle for truth and justice was only beginning. The discovery of Laci Peterson's remains in April 2003 changed everything. For nearly 4 months, the case had been built on suspicion, circumstantial evidence, and a gnawing sense that Scott Peterson knew more than he was saying. But now, there was no denying it: Laci and her unborn son, Connor, were dead. When detectives heard that the remains had washed ashore near the Berkeley Marina, their hearts sank. That was the very location Scott had insisted he went fishing on the morning of Laci's disappearance. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. The fetus was found first small, fragile, still partially protected by the soft remnants of the womb. The next day, the remains of an adult female surfaced nearby. They were badly decomposed, but investigators immediately recognized details consistent with Laci's description: dark hair, matching height, and a telltale maternity pants fragment that clung to what was left of the body. DNA analysis confirmed what everyone feared. The remains belonged to Laci Peterson and her unborn child. The grim discovery not only confirmed a murder, it tied the crime directly to the one person investigators had suspected all along: Scott Peterson. For months, detectives had tried to be sure. They'd followed him, tracked his calls, analyzed his financial movements. But Laci's body and the location it surfaced gave them the connection they needed. The timing of the discovery was almost eerie. As police waited for DNA confirmation, they also noticed Scott's behavior had grown increasingly erratic. He seemed to know something was coming. He was making unusual purchases: camping gear, hiking boots, and several prepaid cell phones. He sold Laci's car and began discussing selling their home. He even reached out to old friends, asking strange, disconnected questions about starting over. But the most alarming move came just before his arrest. On April 18, 2003, the same day the DNA results confirmed the remains were Laci's, police learned that Scott had vanished from Modesto. His phone was off, his accounts inactive. For investigators, the fear was immediate: he was on the run. They issued an alert, and soon after, officers spotted him near La Jolla, California, close to the Mexican border. When they pulled him over, what they found inside the car sent chills down their spines. Scott was driving his mother's vehicle. Inside were camping supplies, knives, over $15,000 in cash, multiple cell phones, survival gear, and his brother's driver's license. His hair had been dyed blonde, and his goatee had been lightened, a weak attempt at disguise. To police, it was obvious. He wasn't going fishing this time. He was running. Scott was arrested on the spot and charged with 2 counts of murder, one for Laci and one for baby Connor. The nation that had followed the desperate search for Laci Peterson now watched as the case turned into one of the most explosive murder trials in modern history. As the story broke, television networks scrambled to broadcast every detail. The smiling family photos of Scott and Laci were now symbols of deceit. The perfect husband image had crumbled, replaced by that of a manipulative killer who wanted freedom at any cost. When police searched Scott's home, they uncovered even more damning evidence. There were receipts showing he had purchased a new boat just weeks before Laci disappeared, something he never told his family about. And in that boat, investigators found a handmade anchor, molded from concrete. Several bags of cement had been purchased before Laci vanished, but only one anchor existed. The rest of the cement was gone. Forensic specialists later recreated the weight and shape of those homemade anchors. They concluded that multiple weights would have been enough to keep a human body submerged at least, until decomposition and water currents released it. Then there were Scott's phone records. On the day Laci disappeared, his cell phone pinged towers along the exact route to and from the Berkeley Marina. His story had been consistent, but his alibi had placed him directly near the crime scene. In court filings, prosecutors presented a chilling theory. Scott Peterson had murdered his wife at home, likely the night before Christmas Eve, then transported her body to the marina under the guise of a fishing trip. Using his small boat and homemade anchors, he had disposed of her in the bay, believing the tides and distance would erase every trace. But he underestimated how far the truth could travel. Amber Frey's recorded phone calls became the emotional centerpiece of the investigation. In them, Scott could be heard calmly lying to her, describing romantic vacations, plans for the future, and pretending to be a widower, all while knowing his wife's body lay at the bottom of the bay. In one call, Amber asked him directly about the vigil for Laci, held on New Year's Eve. Scott told her he was in Paris, watching fireworks over the Eiffel Tower. But police surveillance placed him in Modesto that very night, standing in the crowd as candles flickered, and Laci's family prayed for her return. When those recordings were made public, the nation's outrage exploded. The contrast between Scott's cool, detached voice on the phone and the raw pain of Laci's family was unforgettable. The evidence was stacking up. The lies, the affair, the boat, the cement, the money, the disguise, each detail formed a pattern no one could ignore. But what truly sealed the case wasn't just the evidence, it was the emotion behind it. Jurors and the public alike saw a man who, when faced with responsibility and fatherhood, chose selfishness and freedom over love and loyalty. Laci's family, who had once stood beside Scott at press conferences, now sat in court and listened to the truth unfold, each revelation a deeper wound. They learned that while they searched for their daughter, Scott had been attending parties, flirting, and planning a new life. When the district attorney finally announced that Scott Peterson would face the death penalty, many felt a small measure of justice, though it would never bring Laci and Connor back. The moment police placed Scott in handcuffs marked the end of one chapter, the search, and the beginning of another, a courtroom battle that would reveal, piece by piece, how a picture-perfect life turned into a nightmare. And as the world watched, the man once seen as a grieving husband prepared to face judgment not just from a jury, but from an entire nation. The arrest of Scott Peterson marked the end of a nationwide search, but the beginning of a courtroom saga that would grip America for years to come. When Scott was brought back to Modesto in handcuffs, the world's cameras were already waiting. The man once seen pleading for his wife's safe return was now accused of killing her. The media dubbed it the trial of the century. And for many, it became more than a criminal case. It was a national obsession. In June 2004, the trial began in Redwood City, California. The prosecution's case was built on motive, deceit, and timing. They didn't have direct physical evidence, no blood, no weapon, no witnesses. But they had something just as powerful: Scott's lies. The prosecution argued that Scott Peterson had carefully planned the murder of his wife. They said he wanted freedom, freedom from marriage, from fatherhood, from the life he had built. And the affair with Frey was proof of that. He wanted to start fresh, and Laci's pregnancy had become, in his mind, a problem to solve. Prosecutor Rick Distasso told jurors, Scott Peterson didn't want to be a dad. He didn't want to be married. So he decided to remove the obstacle. He painted a vivid picture of what likely happened. Sometime on the night of December 23rd, or early the next morning, Scott killed Laci at their home, possibly while she slept. He then wrapped her body, loaded it into his truck, and drove to the Berkeley Marina, where he dumped her into the bay. Forensic experts testified that the currents of the San Francisco Bay were strong enough to carry Laci's body from the location where Scott said he was fishing to the shoreline, where she and baby Connor were later found. The prosecution also introduced the receipts for the concrete mix, the boat purchase, and phone records that traced Scott's route to and from the marina. But the most damning evidence emotionally and psychologically came from Frey. When she took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Amber described how Scott had swept her off her feet, how he'd said he was a widower, and how he'd looked her in the eyes and said he wanted a future with her. Then she told the jury how she found out who he really was, not through confession, but through the evening news. She recounted the phone calls, the lies, and how she agreed to help police by recording every conversation. Jurors listened as Scott's smooth, calm voice filled the courtroom, talking about their new life together. Even as the world searched for Laci, Frey's testimony humanized the case in a way no forensic evidence could. It showed Scott's capacity for deception and painted a clear picture of motive. The defense fought back hard. They argued that the evidence was entirely circumstantial, that Scott's affair didn't prove murder. Defense attorney Mark Garagos insisted that police had ignored other possible suspects, people who might have abducted Laci while she was walking the dog. They claimed the bodies could have been dumped into the bay later by someone else, and that Scott's strange behavior stemmed from fear and media pressure, not guilt. But the jury wasn't convinced. Throughout the trial, Scott's demeanor remained cold. He rarely showed emotion, even as prosecutors displayed photos of Laci smiling, pregnant, full of life. Even when Frey described his lies in painful detail, Scott sat stone-faced. The jury deliberated for 7 days. On November 12, 2004, they reached a verdict. Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Laci Peterson and second-degree murder for the death of their unborn son, Connor. As the verdict was read, gasps echoed through the courtroom. Outside, crowds cheered and wept. For Laci's family, it was the justice they had prayed for, though it came wrapped in heartbreak. A month later, the same jury recommended the death penalty. In March 2005, Scott Peterson was formally sentenced to die by lethal injection. The judge told him, "You betrayed her trust. You betrayed your son. You betrayed your family. You betrayed everyone." He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he would live out his days in isolation. But the story didn't end there. Over the years, Scott's defense team launched a series of appeals, claiming the case was tainted by media frenzy and juror misconduct. They argued that the trial had been unfair, that Scott had been convicted, not just by evidence, but by public hatred. In 2020, after nearly 15 years on death row, the California Supreme Court agreed to overturn Scott Peterson's death sentence, citing improper juror screening during the penalty phase. However, his murder convictions remained intact. In 2021, Scott was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Laci's family, the long road through the courts brought little comfort. No sentence could bring back the daughter, wife, and soon-to-be mother they'd lost. Sharon Rocha, Laci's mother, later said, "Justice was served, but there's no such thing as closure. You just learn to live with the pain." Over 2 decades later, the case still resonates not because of its legal twists, but because of the emotional devastation it left behind. Laci Peterson's story became a cautionary tale about trust, appearances, and how darkness can hide behind the most ordinary smiles. It changed how the media covered missing persons cases and how the public viewed domestic homicide. Even now, people continue to debate whether Scott truly acted alone, or whether his conviction was the result of overwhelming public pressure. But to those who knew Laci, the truth is far simpler. A kind-hearted woman, her unborn son, and a family forever changed by betrayal. Her memory endures not through the headlines, but through the love. Her family continues to carry a love that outlived the lies, the cameras, and even the courtroom. Because in the end, this story isn't just about a murder. It's about the light that was lost, and the fight to make sure it was never forgotten. As the years pass, the story of Laci Peterson remains one of the most haunting chapters in American true crime history. It's a reminder that behind every headline is a family waiting, praying, and holding on to hope, even when the truth becomes unbearable. Laci's face, once seen on missing posters and nightly news broadcasts, has become a lasting symbol of innocence stolen too soon. And while the courts may have delivered justice, her family's loss can never truly be measured. When we look back at this case, we're forced to confront uncomfortable questions. How well do we really know the people closest to us? And how far can love blind us to the truth? For those who followed the case from the beginning, the tragedy of Laci Peterson is not just about betrayal. It's about the cracks that can form beneath a picture-perfect life, hidden until it's too late to see them. If there's one thing that this story leaves behind, it's the importance of awareness, of listening, noticing, and never ignoring when something feels wrong. Because sometimes the warning signs are there. We just don't want to believe them. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Justice Vault. If you were moved by Laci's story, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe justice was truly served in this case? And if you'd like to hear more deep dive investigations into real stories like this one, make sure to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications so you never miss a case that still echoes through time. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, truth always finds its way out of the dark.